Let us start with our third project, and in this we are going to use complex state update logic, and instead of passing primitive values for initial state and primitive value for action, now we are going to pass object for initial state and also we are going to pass object for action. So now in this I am having complete container. I have displayed the count. Initial value is 0. Again I have displayed count. Initial value is 5. Now here when I click on this increment, just focus on this count. Click on this, value is increased by 1. Again I will click. Each and every time this count is updated. This count and this value is not affected. Only this first statement is updated. Now here I will click on decrement. You can see only this is updated. Now here I am having third button increment. I will click on this. Each and every time I am adding 5 values. Again I will click. You can see each and every time I am adding 5 values. Now for this, when I click on decrement, each and every time I am decreasing by 5 values. Then I am having reset button. When I click on this, whatever value I am having, that will be updated. But now we are having second count statement and initial value I have given as 5. Now I am just going to click on this increment. You can see each and every time value will be increased by 2. Again I will click on this. Each and every time value is increased by 2. When I click on decrement, each and every time value is decreased by 2. So now in total, I am having 7 buttons. So for this, if I had used useState, then I should be using 7 event handlers and accordingly I have to update the logic. And here initially I am displaying different value. I will refresh and here I am displaying different value. So for this I have to create 2 states and accordingly I have to perform this entire operation. But now this complexity can be simplified using our useReducer hook. So now in this you will better understand useReducer structure and also you will be able to handle complex state updates. So now inside this SRC I am going to create one folder. I will write counter object. I will simply write counter object and inside this I will create one file counter.js. And from this counter reducer I am just going to copy entire code and inside this I am going to paste. I will close this. I will come to app.js. Now instead of counter reducer, here I will be writing counter object. From this folder, I just want to access my counter.js. Now I'm just going to save. Come here, refresh once. This is the previous project what we have created. I have simply changed the styling. Now here, if you notice, this is my initial state. For this, I have passed simple primitive value and this is my action. For this also, I have passed simple primitive value. Now what we are going to do, instead of passing these primitive values for both initial state and action, we are going to pass object. And this is how you will be working in complex project. You will not be passing direct values. Instead, you will be passing object. So first, I will come to initial state. Remove this 0. Instead, I will be writing this object literal. Now I am going to create the property. I will write counter and for this I will assign the value as 0. So my initial state is nothing but object. So here object will be passed and my state is nothing but object. Now inside object I am having this counter property. So to display that this is my state, which is nothing but object, and from that object I have to access counter property. So here I will write count.counter. Simple enough. Save it. Come here. Refresh this. Again, I am going to have default value as 0. If I do not give this dot counter, then I will not be having any result, because now initial state is object. It is simply like we have passed here object, and inside that we have passed counter as 0. Now to access this property, we are going to write dot 0. I will just bring my initial state back. Simple enough. So what I have done, I have just made initial state as object. I will be showing you advantages of using these objects as well. Now here inside this dispatch, in place of this primitive value for action, I will be writing object, and for this I will give the property as type. Mostly this is the convention, so you can also follow the same convention. Now this is my action. Action is nothing but object. Action will be passed here, which is nothing but object, but from that object I have to access type. So whenever I am checking for this expression, now action is nothing but object. Now from that object I have to access that type property which is having this value. So here I have to write action dot type. Now I will come down. Same thing, I will just wrap inside curly braces. It is nothing but object. I will pass the type property. Similarly, for this, I'm just going to wrap inside curly braces. And after that, I'm just going to give type. So this entire thing is my action. This expression will be passed here. Now from that object, I am only accessing type property. And accordingly, based on the request, the operation will be performed. Okay, successfully, we have performed two steps. We have changed initial state to object, and also we have changed our action to object. But inside reducer function, based on the request, we have to return new state. But as of now, our state is object, but here I am returning simple primitive value. So I will come here. When I click on this, value will be disappeared. I will not be having any functionality. Why? Because I am simply returning primitive value, but my state is an object. So when I am returning, I have to return object. You have to write this curly braces. Let me increase the size. Now what I have to do? I have to return new state. And inside this state, I have given this property as counter. So whenever I am returning, I just want to change the value of this counter. So here I will be writing counter, and this counter will be nothing but state, this state, initial state dot counter plus 1. So this is my object property, and for this object property I am just doing state dot counter. I will access this counter. Here I will be having 0. Then I am just adding 1. So 1 will be given for this counter. So whenever we change our initial state and action to object, accordingly we have to return new state, and that new state will also be an object. And inside that state, I am only changing this counter property. So that is the reason I have mentioned my counter property, and for this I have assigned this value. Similarly, for this decrement, I will remove write object. Here I will be writing counter state dot counter, then I have to subtract 1. And here what I have to do, instead of returning 0, I'm just going to return my initial state, which is nothing but I'm just going to return this object. So here I do not have to create any object, because my initial state itself an object, so I do not have to pass any curly braces. If no case is getting matched, simply I'm just returning my state, which is nothing but object. Okay, simple enough. I will come here, refresh once, 0 is displayed. I'm going to click, you can see now successfully this functionality is working, decrement as well as reset. So let me revise what we have done. For this initial state, I have just created object and inside that I have given counter property which is assigned to 0. And while dispatching for this action also, I have made object and inside this switch simply I am just getting value of this type property and accordingly I am just going to check for the cases. If it is increment, I am returning new state and now my state is nothing but object, so I have to return object and inside this object I am just updating my counter value. So each and every time when I click, I am increasing the value by 1 and each and every time when I click for this decrement, I am decreasing the value by 1 and for this reset directly I am just setting it to initial state. But now let us understand advantages of passing this object. So inside object we already know we can pass multiple properties along with their values. Now here using this increment, what I am doing, whenever I click on this button, I am just incrementing the value by 1 and when I click on this decrement button, I am just decrementing the value by 1. Now what I want, instead of incrementing by 1 or decrementing by 1, I just want to increase the value by 5 as well as I want to decrease the value by 5 along with incrementing by 1 and decrementing by 1. This functionality should be there. Along with this, I should increase the value by 5 and decrease the value by 5. So what we can do, inside this action, we can pass another property. You can give any name for the property, but mostly many developers will follow this convention and they simply give the property as payload. So for this button, I will give the value as 1. Again, I am going to copy and for this decrement also, I am just going to pass. Now my action is nothing but this entire object. I will come here. Now here, instead of directly adding 1, what I will do from this action, okay, whatever action we are having, here I have accessed the type. Accordingly, I am performing the operation. But while adding the value from this action object, I am just going to access my payload. Same thing, instead of -1, I will write action.payload. Save it. Come here. Again, if I click on this, successfully operation will be performed. So here what I have done, whenever we are passing this object, we will have more advantage and we can pass multiple values inside this object. So using this first property, we are requesting the action to be performed and using this second property, we are just updating our state and we are adding this value. Now what I will do, I'm just going to copy these two buttons. Below this, I will be pasting. Now instead of 1, I will give here payload as 5. Here also, I'm going to give payload as 5. Save it. Now two buttons are created. Now payload is 5. Let me just come here. So first my initial state is 0. 0 plus action dot payload. Action dot payload is nothing but 5. So initially when I click on that button, I will be increasing the value by 5. So for this button, you can see I am able to increase the value by 5 and also when I click on this, I am able to decrease the value by 5 and this reset will be working as usual. So this is how this payload will be working, but it is optional, but in most of the cases, this payload will be very helpful. So this is the first advantage of passing object to action. Now let us see the second advantage. Now here I have displayed counter. Initial value I have given 0. Now what I want? I just want to display another text. So simply what I can do, inside this initial state, I can directly pass another property. So here I will write counter1 initial value I am going to give 5. I will come down below this h2. I will be creating one more h2. Now from this count state, I am just going to access my counter1 property. I will come here, refresh once. Now you can see 5 is displayed. Why? Because I am just accessing this counter property, and for this property we have given 5 and that 5 will be displayed. And using this state variable, we are accessing initial state value. Now what I want, I will be creating two more buttons. Whenever I click on other buttons, accordingly, I just want to update this count. So I'll come here. I'm just going to copy these two cases. Below this, I will be pasting. I will write increment 1, decrement 1. Now inside this object, now what I am having two properties. This is my counter and this is my counter 1. So when this first increment is happening, what I want to do, first I just want to return the same object, and inside that object I only want to change this counter property. So here we are going to use spread operator and I will be writing state. So this entire object will be copied, and inside that object I am only changing this counter property. Similarly, here also I am going to copy, paste it here, only counter property I am changing. Now inside this increment, again I am just going to copy entire object. Now instead of changing counter property, I just want to change counter 1 property. And here I will write state dot counter 1 plus action dot payload. Here also I am just going to return my entire state as it is. And inside that object, I am only changing this counter 1 property. Then I am accessing state dot counter minus action dot payload. Simple enough. Now I am just going to come down. I will copy these two buttons. Below this, I will be pasting. Now for this, I will write increment 1 and for this decrement 1. Come here, refresh this. You can see two buttons are created. Now I am just going to click on this increment. Each and every time value is increased by 5. So what I will do, I will just change the payload value to 2. Save it. Come here, refresh this. Now you can see each and every time I am able to increase and decrease the value by 2. So using this, I am able to increase and decrease by 1. Using this, I am able to increase and decrease by 5. And using this, I am able to increase and decrease the second state by 2 values. And again, when I click on this reset, everything will be reset. Okay, not only this one, this value will also be reset. Let me show you. Here I will be writing. As soon as I click on reset, initial value is 0, initial value is 5. Why? Because whenever we click on this reset, we are returning initial state. And inside initial state, counter will be 0 and counter 1 will be 5. So these are the two advantages of passing initial state as object and action as object. So using initial state as object, we can pass multiple states inside that, and accordingly we can return the new state. And finally, whenever we are passing this, if we want to update based on these values, accordingly we have to perform the action inside this switch statement. I hope you understood. As a beginner, it is very overwhelming and maybe it is difficult to understand the structure, but take your time. Just whatever I have taught you, just type by yourself. Even if you are not understanding, just type 2 to 3 times. Then you will be able to understand the concept, as well as you will be able to get the structure of useReducer. And understanding this structure is very important because this is the same structure we are going to use in our complex projects.